So thanks very much, Aoife, and everybody here for inviting me to come and talk to you about architecture. Do you need me that, or can you hear me okay? No? I'm getting that. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much to Aoife and everyone for inviting me to come and talk to you about this thing we call architecture. Are there any architects here? Anyone who would identify as being an architect? No? One, two of us, okay. That's okay, because my theory is that we are all architects anyway, so it's very good to have everybody here and to talk to you about this. And I guess what I'm going to do is talk to you about a number of projects that are not necessarily public art projects, though one of them is, but are all projects that have been made by architects that exist in the public realm and have attempted at some level to offer a position or a point of view or some elaboration on what architecture might mean in a public realm context. And some of the projects, in fact all of the projects are funded publicly, they're not private commissions, and therefore do have something to contribute to the conversation. And I guess it's also very important to remember that very often when I talk to architects about this, they come up back with the question that all architecture exists in the public realm because we make buildings, which is the primary output of architecture. Architectural discourse and practice makes buildings, which contain rooms and space. And of course, they all do exist in real life in 3 dimensions outside. We're in one right now. But the context for this talk is I guess, is slightly different to that. And it's in a way to try and elaborate what architecture might mean within this context, which I think is very exciting for the practice and discussion around architecture. And there are practitioners here who aren't trained as architects, but I know are extremely adept and have a lot of skill and knowledge and sophistication in terms of how they might use or participate in an architecture in order to further their practice and further the discourse. So what has tended to happen in the last couple of years when I start to talk about architecture in rooms is to offer this definition of what architecture is, because it's always good to remember, I think, and I think people have a lot of assumptions about what it is, partly to do with this definition, which is if you go to any dictionary, this is what it says architecture is: the art of or practice of designing and constructing buildings. And personally, I really hate this definition, not because I have anything against buildings, but because it excludes this person. It doesn't talk about use or occupation or any sort of social process that might occur when the architect has taken his or her photographs and left. So it's a very controlled and very closed down definition of what architecture is. And I think that's very unfortunate because architecture is a much more, potentially much more politically engaged, socially engaged, and I suppose a process which has a lot more to offer and to do in society than just make buildings which don't really want people to use them. So one other definition I'm offering today is this one by Jonathan Hill, which is that architecture is not just a building, it is primarily a particular relation between a subject, which is a human, and an object, which is something else, in which the former occupies the latter, which is not necessarily a building, but can be a space, a text, an artwork, or any other phenomenon that displays or refers to the subject-object relations particular to architecture. So this definition is good because it says we're talking about architecture, we're not apologizing for that, but actually there's other things going on within that process, and what we really want to do is include people and to understand the various relations between people and the things that are being made, whether they be buildings or not, and that those social processes and social discussions are really relevant to our understanding of architecture. So I'm going to look at 3 projects with you, and there are 2 projects that I haven't put on the slide that I just wanted to mention. And I left them out because they're in schools, and I didn't want necessarily to go down that road today. But there are 2 very strong public art Present for Art projects that have come out recently by young architects in emerging practice. One is the Hedge School in Carlow by Architecture Practice and Experimentation, which is an outdoor classroom built in a primary school in Carlow. And the other is by Alan Meredith's studio, which is Newpark Comprehensive, which is part of a Present for Art scheme, which is commissioned by Ashton Pryor. And both of those are very interesting in terms of the relationship of the architect to the school community. But the 3 I've chosen are chosen because they offer perhaps this thing that Aoife asked me to respond to, which is to do with temporality and the public realm, more specifically. The first is not built in Ireland and doesn't exist anymore. And you may know last year, when it was the Year of Irish Design, there was a very ambitious project led by curators Natalie Wadick and Raymond Ryan, who decided to place architecture in 3 international festival and 1 national festival contexts, and to commission a series of 10 architects to make work around the world for that. So in London, last June, there were 2 projects built in King's Cross, and King's Cross is a privately owned, so it's owned by a private developer, but it's a publicly labelled, or it's just, it's intended to notionally be public space that's policed privately, to make 2 temporary pavilions in there, pavilions which were there on site for 3 weeks, and which cost, I would say, based on my estimate, but based on figures I've got, the best part of €100,000 to place there for 3 weeks, if you add in time and construction costs, all of which were done for nothing. So these 2 pavilions were placed there. They were very, serious pieces of architectural work. The yellow pavilion was made by Hall McKnight in Belfast, and the red pavilion was made as a collaboration between 3 Dublin practices, Taka, Clancy Moore and Steve Larkin. And the idea was that these 2 pavilions were placed at either end of this square, which is part of a developing program which wasn't quite finished. That those 2 pavilions offered, I suppose, venues as part of the London Festival of Architecture for things to occur, particularly the red pavilion, which was designed to hold events underneath its canopy, and also on the upper level to become something which you might view out onto the platform. And these spaces became an assembly point and part, I suppose, of a program or an event-led sort of festival where various talks and events happened across. These were built very fast, that they were very high quality. The commission was offered in February. They were on site, in June, which is quite quick, given the complexity and ambition that the architects had. And they're now in storage. So the second project is one that Holly, who's in the audience, will be very familiar with. And sorry to pick on you, but I'm always conscious of talking about people's work when they're in the room, because I'm so not an expert in this project. But over the last best part of 10 years, I think in Callan, I think probably the most significant project in socially engaged architecture has emerged. It's a remarkable piece of work by a remarkable group of people and a remarkable, I suppose, community who have supported this project over the last number of years. I think what's very interesting is that the project appears to have evolved on the ground and locally in response to particular conditions over time, and is a sustained and a kind of grounded and a long-term approach to how, not just architecture, but I'm going to talk about architecture today, but how architecture has a role to play within understanding citizenship, identity, reuse, building, I suppose, a stronger network of community by being inclusive, by offering people opportunities to participate in physical building activities, and therefore to kind of use architecture as a more strategic thing. As part of a wider sort of strategy about public engagement and public participation. The first project is Breach by Culture Struction, which is Tara Kennedy and Joanne Butler. And this is a project which is a temporary pavilion within a series of disused buildings here, which was an indoor and outdoor performance space. And it was done in collaboration with the Aaron Nree Festival in 2011. The kind of strategic approach was to use readily available skills and materials. So rather than necessarily designing something in one place and bringing it to another context, this was sort of intended to be emerge from where things were. And it's about this sort of strategy, I think that's very strong here, but is an emerging one as well in contemporary architectural practice, which is, and I know it happens in other forms of art practice, which is understanding, I suppose, the local assets that already exist in a community. And how do you harness those, include those, and give people kind of authority and agency to participate in something which becomes a very fruitful part then of community life. The artist, interesting to declare this as a kind of an antidote to the first project, where there is a sort of an immense investment within architectural culture in the temporary pavilion. And this one, as I said, has emerged in the ground and seems then, therefore, I would think, to have lasted longer than perhaps originally intended, because it's become more embedded in the kind of culture and the psyche of the community. And it also, pragmatically, in terms of what architecture does, right? It solves use, it solves desires and needs, that people need things in order to do things. So this provides a location and a focus for community to gather and for indoor and outdoor lectures to take place as part of that Aonarí and then further festivals. The other project to talk about is, again, by Culture Struction, which is part of Commonage in 2010, which is created by Culture Struction and Rosie Lynch, is this Glittery Embrace project, which, again, is a very subtle project. It's where these lads are sitting here on the edge of the river. And it deals with this particular community, which is teenagers, which is a very particular community, often ignored, I think, spatially. And you know, if you've ever worked with anyone who talks about catering for teenagers, there's often a very negative connotation that they're just destructive and annoying and in the way, and etc. And there may be all of those things, but they're also people and need space and have spatial needs, and tend to occupy space in really interesting and provocative ways. And I think this project emerged from a noticing of this particular pump station in a place where the artists noticed that the kids were gathering and decided to construct a platform which would allow people to loiter more sophisticatedly, more relaxed, and to have a discussion. And then it was also built as part of which is one of the very strong things I think about this project in Callan as well, has been a series of summer schools which have included local residents and then students of architecture and people from all over the place to come and participate and make something which has a kind of legacy. So the final project I'll just speak about is a project that I'm involved in. It's called Home on the Grange, and this is a project which is funded in the Grange Gorman Public Art Programme, The Lives We Live, and it's a project we were funded back in February to do, and we finally figured out what it was in July, and we're working on it now, and it's a very slow process. So I think the projects as we've moved are a little bit different, I think, in terms of time. Sorry, that colour is very strange. It's called Home on the Grange because, back to my very first point, we made a proposal that, I suppose the theme of the Lives We Live project in Grange Gorman is this very changing and shifting physical landscape. The commissioners wanted to figure out about and to include more parts of the community in that process, to use public art as a way of doing that, and to come up and ask people to come forward with ideas about how public art might facilitate that. The project is a three-part project insofar as myself. Emmett is an architect and curator and writer and sort of agitator and fundraiser, as it's transpired, and Ashley McCoy, who's a photographer, who is also an architect but now works as a photographer, and both of us have a very particular interest in the home and the ideology of home, particularly within Irish society. And then the third person is Paul Guinan, who's a graphic designer, who was very important, I think, in terms of communicating and facilitating a local discussion about architecture. We wanted him on board from the start, so the three of us came forward with this proposition called Home on the Grange, and our idea was to I suppose, harness what we consider to be this unacknowledged and sort of hidden creativity in how people make home, which is where my kind of thesis about us all being architects comes into it. We are looking at how people make their home architectures, these sort of micro-architectures, and we're working with the community to develop, I suppose, a way of documenting them, recording them, and presenting them. The idea being that as we do so, we're taking what's essentially part of the private realm and making it part of the public discussion. It also allows us to cover this issue of diversity and different nationalities and new communities and ages, because we found, obviously, that what we all have in common is this desire to make home and this capacity to do so. So we've been working in the neighbourhood, and we took this approach that we decided not to work with any local resource organisation or any established community group. We decided to try and find one for ourselves. So the area that's shown in the blue there is the entire Grange Gorman neighbourhood, which is about 26 potential 1,000 people we could talk to. And so we have been literally coming up with ideas and strategies and walking the streets to try and invite and encourage people to participate in this project. And that's a slow process because it requires time and people have to trust you. And obviously if someone knocks on your door, which we haven't done yet, we wouldn't do it so literally, but if someone does knock on your door and asks you, can they come in and talk to you about your house and photograph you, you're going to say, no, I would. So it's a question of how we do this. And it's partly bringing in skills that we've developed in other fora, kind of ethnographic research skills, where you have to spend a lot of time, which is marvellous, in a sense, talking to people about things and going back and talking to people about things again and again. And that's sort of my role in this, is the sort of home visit scenario, and in parallel Aisling is making photographs. So we've started that process, and some of the work has started to emerge, particularly in the last weekend. so that's a little dark. But so what we're doing is we're going in and we're photographing spaces. Now Aisling gets upset when I say we're not editing things, because obviously a photographer edits everything when she frames a photograph. But what I mean by that is, coming from an architectural context, what we're not doing is we're not asking people to tidy up, and people actually don't really want to tidy up, in my experience. People are quite happy to not tidy up. The first thing they ask is, do I have to tidy up? And I say no, and they're like delighted. They breathe a sigh of relief and go back and lie on the couch. But so we're talking, which is great. We're talking to people and we're photographing these spaces as we go. And we've so far documented a whole range of photographs and stories for 3 houses, or 3 homes. The third of which is the City Squat in Grange, which has since been demolished. And as part of the process, and this I could talk to you about this for hours. It's a fascinating place. As part of the process, what we've been doing, as you can see here on the Grange, we've been making a series of newspapers. And we have 3 editions of the newspaper, which is called Home on the Grange. There's 1,000 copies per print. And we have been distributing these in and around the neighbourhood, which is, again, a kind of walking the street scenario. And as part of our strategy to find ways of finding different kinds of people to participate in the project, we've entered into kind of a loose relationship with the salons and barbers in the area. So they're carrying the newspapers for us, the idea being that as people are getting their hair cut, and hair also is something which is very ethnically diverse and age dependent, and varies from place to place across that neighbourhood very, very differently, in fact. The idea being that as people do that, they read this paper, and hopefully they are participants in the project, obviously, by that act, and then hopefully people will come forward and talk to us about participating in the project. There's Eleanor. The other thing we did was last weekend we had a concert called Songs About Home, which again was another way of building kind of credibility and faith within the community. And we had a concert on the campus in Grange with 31 performers and an audience of 150. Sorry, that photograph is so dark. This is an amazingly beautiful photograph by Aisling of Liam up in the squat. But anyway, we had a concert, and again, the idea is that we're trying to find other ways of discussing and presenting architecture within a community. So this theme, of course, of home is something that's very, very accessible. So we had an evening which was spoken word, some texts which were written by people who've participated in the project and whose homes we visited, some texts written by me. We commissioned Nathan O'Donnell, a local writer, to write a very specific story in a response to one photograph that Aisling has made, and that was sung and spoken on the night. And then the other thing we've done this weekend is to have an exhibition, sort of a pop-up as part of the project, in order to again generate kind of local interest, and that's kind of in participation with local business owners. And you can find out more about that project there. That's it. Thank you.